Well, Jim didn't really give us any marching orders about what he wanted us to talk about, other than kind of retracing the sort of trajectory of our varied careers and the logic, if there were a logic, to how we kind of went through what we did. So we've actually been kind of informally chatting about this and thinking, what do we want to talk about and what do we want to ignore? So yeah, we have some certain commonalities. Mack and I met in effectively in the Dijon archives. We formally met at the FHS conference in Columbus, Ohio, I think, in 1985, and I had already finished my dissertation on Dijon and Burgundy, and he wanted to get into the Burgundian archives, and subsequent conversations for about almost 40 years led to a deep friendship and sharing of knowledge and wonderful personal experiences, drinking great wine and eating terrific food. And
we should mention here, just in passing, that for many years the three of us boycotted the banquet at French Historical Studies. And eventually we added more and more people to us. But we always couldn't understand why everybody would eat this crummy hotel food when we were in these wonderful towns with great restaurants.
And pay $50 to
right.
eat a rubber chicken.
And so for years we went out, and Greg Monahan eventually joined us, and then eventually a lot of other people joined us. So this is a long-standing tradition.
It was an especially egregious dereliction of duty on my part because I was editor of the journal of historical studies, and I got no show at the banquet.
And when we ran FHS here in DC, we took everybody with us. We had no banquet, and we went to a restaurant which is now defunct in downtown DC. What was the name of it?
Les Halles,
Les Halles,
Tony
yeah,
Bourdain
right.
branch here in
And
DC.
so we took 120 people out to dinner with us. That worked out pretty well, except for at the end of the dinner, the maitre d' gave me a wine bill. And I said, well, we already paid for the wine. And he said, all those guys down there, Monahan and everybody else, had drunk all this extra wine. I said, I didn't order that. He said, well, you got to pay for it. That was the last time we took 120. And we also, all three of us, worked in the Dijon archives in multiple summers. So maybe that's a good place to start. You know, why Dijon? Quite a few Americans, as we talked about a little bit before, have worked in the Dijon archives. It's one of the places probably where more Americans work in the provinces than in almost any other provincial archive other than Toulouse. Don Sutherland, who's here, you've worked in the Dijon archives, right?
Yes.
Tom, have you ever been on that? So it's why go to Dijon? What kinds of things draw a scholar to a provincial center as opposed to the more traditional Paris?
Well, in my case, I had finished my dissertation on the Duke of Anjou. It was published in 1984. And I was already starting to think about a new project. And my dissertation and subsequent research, revising it, was done primarily in Paris and largely in the manuscript room of the BN, which then and now is on the Rue de Richelieu instead of out at the new library. And I wanted to work in the provinces. I wanted a different kind of research experience. Plus, my entire time in graduate school, my advisor was trying to get me off this boring political history of the Duke of Anjou and pushing me, and of course he wrote political institutional history for his entire career. This is Russell Major on the Estates General. He wanted to push me and all of his other students into a more analyst kind of project. So I said, okay, I'll go into the provinces and do some kind of social, economic history of a local area. And I was teaching at what was then called West Texas State University. It is now West Texas A&M University, and you don't want to go there. Sorry if this goes out. It's in
Canyon? Is it Canyon?
Canyon, Texas, in the Panhandle. You're 8 hours from anywhere larger than Amarillo, which is the biggest city near the campus. And I was invited to attend a lecture at UT Austin by Myron Gutman, who is a well-known economic historian of early modern France. And we were sitting in a restaurant, Tex-Mex restaurant there, and I said, what provinces would be good for doing a socioeconomic study based on the holdings? And he immediately pointed me to Dijon. He says they have greater surviving documentation and more different kinds of sources, from tax rolls to the État civil, birth, marriage, burial records, to criminal records, to the deliberations of the Hotel de Ville. There's a parliament and the parliamentary registers, notarial archives there. He said, try Burgundy. And he also happened to say, it's a nice place to spend time, which turned out to be true. And having known peers, colleagues who had spent a year in places like Amiens, which wasn't so much fun, I thought this would be good. And at about the same time, I discovered your dissertation at Northwestern under Bill Monner on the artisans of Dijon. And when we met, learned about your book, and I guess my first summer in Burgundy was 1986, and you were there. Jim, you were there, en famille, with 3 very young girls. And Hampshire passed through at the beginning of the summer, ended up meeting Bob Schwartz, and there were other Anglophone historians there, and it just turned out to be the best decision I could have made. Now, the project I started working on in 1986 evolved into something very different by, well, today, since the book came out, but a year ago, I guess, when I sent the final manuscript in for review. But it turned out to be a wonderful place to work, and I guess I can't say enough. You know, you go somewhere because of the archives there, and you have some idea of what might be there from the inventaire, the printed inventories, which every university library, of course, doesn't have, but which you can find in, well, you found them in the University of Chicago Library, which wasn't too far from Northwestern. In Canyon, Texas, there was, I ended up having to go to Paris, and of course they have a full set at the AN, where you can consult them, even without a reader's ticket. You go and look at them. But they, of course, just give you the tip of the iceberg. So it turned out to be a wonderful place because of the copious sources. It turned out to be a very nice place to live while you're there, and met some terrific people, mutual friends that you put me onto because you did your dissertation research earlier, and getting to know the local staff. I mean, it's just different. Many of you have worked in provincial archives, and you know, in Paris, whether you're at the BN or the AN, there's just so many people coming in and out, and the staffs are so large. It's rare to get any kind of personal relationship, even, never mind first name basis, with the people, even though you see them and they see you on a more regular basis. But in the provinces, you know, there's, you know, some days in municipal archives there was me and you. In the departmental archives there might be half a dozen. So it's just a different kind of experience than going into the manuscript room of the BN where there are 40 researchers there. And I'm glad I got that different kind of experience.
What drew you to Dijon first?
Yeah, well, I mean, I was late 70s, training in grad school, and of course, as a European historian, especially a French historian, deeply influenced by the analyste approach, and I thought, I want to do that. But peasants have been worked over pretty good. You know, the history bottom up really appealed to me, but Walladouris, Paysan de Languedoc, and Pierre Robert, and you know, So I didn't want to do peasants again, but I thought, oh, what about in the cities? What about doing an analyst approach to some social group in the cities? And I thought about artisans. And then I thought, well, I don't really want to just go to Paris and do a parish. I want to do, remember Histoire Totale? Remember that was part of the buzzword of the analyst? And
Which included everything but politics.
yeah, right.
It wasn't very total.
Well, I got around to that in my career, right? But I thought, well, okay, so I want to do an entire city. And that took me to a big Michelin map. And I looked and I thought, well, what town might be? And then figuring out what archival holdings might be there, the Implantaire-Sommaire, once again, lent itself to some quantitative analysis, which we used to do in social history. And they had a great run of tax rolls, which had name, occupation, street, tax assessment, and that could be quantified. And they had a complete run of the whole town, all 7 parishes, right? So that was very appealing to me. And the deliberations of the town council, and there's an awful lot of discussion about artisans in there, a regulation of guilds. And I thought, well, it looks like there might be enough here, but then as Mack alluded, when you get on site, anybody who's done archival research knows exactly what I'm talking about. A whole new world opens up. And there are sources there that are not in the inventory, and they just, you stumble upon them, or a friendly archivist will say, you need to take a look at this. And that's when I discovered the uncatalogued notarial records, which were a treasure trove for me because they're marriage contracts, which I got a statistical sample of, and also real estate purchases and sales, and I found artisans to be very active in the real estate market. And a lot of them were carpenters and masons who were buying fixer-uppers, which I thought was really kind of cute. An old dilapidated, building, come in and fix it up and then sell it or rent it. So it lent itself to an analyst kind of study. But the great source that was not cataloged, I discovered when I was there, and Drouot actually mentions it in passing with these first instant criminal records. And those were just chock full of depositions of witnesses. And I wasn't particularly interested in the crimes per se. I was more interested in what people were saying about their daily lives at the time the crime was committed. And you get into an awful lot of, a lot of information of just really the voices of the direct voices of the past. I mean, it was because these are supposed to be written down verbatim by the court reporter, the greffier. And so it just lent itself to that kind of a study. But once I discovered these criminal records and this kind of evidence, which is really not quantifiable, it kind of pushed me into what was already occurring in our profession, which was sort of a transition to cultural history. The French were already doing this mentalité business, but we were starting to see the beginnings of the new methodology of the new cultural history and interpretation of language and sources and stuff like that. And what I discovered was that a code of honor was very prominent among these artisans, and that's where the title of the book comes from. So, hands of honor. And so that kind of just got me started, and that's when I met Mack, and that book came out I think in '88, and then I ran with that source, those criminal records, because a lot of the honor was built around sexual immorality. Not of the men so much, but certainly of the men's women, right? Their wives, their mothers, and their daughters, and a lot of slanders in the streets were directed at what your mother is, or what your wife is, and then Guido Ruggiero was editing a series, the History of Sexuality series, and he says, sure sounds like there's a lot of sexuality in those records, if you could write a book for me for my series. And sure, I can do that. I'm looking for a second project. So there was sort of an archival logic here that took me, but that's not a quantitative analysis. And it brought me into the world of the law, prescription, and practice. And that, of course, led directly to that, which is very different in style, of course. It's a microhistory, and written in a presentation. It's quite different from the earlier works. I've done all 3 of those archival books are quite different. Mainly because I just wanted to try something different. I think just let your creative urges held, as Natalie would say, tightly ingrained by the historical evidence, but use your imagination, and that was kind of what I wanted to do, make the research and the writing of what I do fun, enjoyable. Right?
Now, I'll mention briefly the two people, Drouot, he mentions Henri Drouot, great French historian, the interwar period, who worked on Burgundy, wrote a 2-volume book, Mayenne, the Duke of Mayenne, in La Bourgogne, which is a classic study of Burgundy during the wars of religion. And Ruggiero is best associated with Mike, talking about microhistory. And many conferences with him doing microhistory. So it's interesting that you would do a microhistory as a spin-off that you did of a book for him, right? Because that's exactly the sort of thing. So if you, those of you who are not familiar with the field, he's an interesting person to read if you want to get some sense of microhistory. Works on 16th, 17th century Italy. He was at Florida, didn't he, at Florida?
He's been raised in Miami.
He's in Miami.
Uh-huh.
That's right.
Miami at Florida.
Yeah, Miami, Florida.
To return to Bill Beik for a minute.
Right.
My second book wasn't this book on the vigneron in Burgundy. I mean, I was finding vignerons everywhere you were finding artisans. In fact, you know, they were neighbors and involved in the same political demonstrations and all of that. But because Cambridge had published my first book, the then history editor, Richard Fisher, he was trying to push me, wouldn't you like to write a general textbook, a general history on the wars of religion? I said, I've just published my first book. Don't you need a more experienced historian to write an overview? I'm still learning. And he said, no, Bill Beik said you would be a good candidate. And there were Bill Beik, Tim Blanning, I think there was...
Yeah, it was the third person.
Third person, I can't remember. Anyway, Bill contacted me. And, I mean, Richard had issued me a contract before I'd even written a word of it. And by the time I had a complete draft, Bill suggested, and I thought this was a great idea, why don't you let me try it out on my undergrads at Emory? I teach a class on old regime France, and we start in the 16th century. And I got some very useful suggestions. He sent me a whole class worth, 35 students, each writing what they liked and what they didn't like. And I'd never even heard of a book being treated that way. And as a series editor, I mean, it happened to overlap with his teaching interest. It worked out really great. And he's just been very supportive ever since, all the way through his life, and always supportive of younger historians.
Yeah.
As I'm sure most of you know. But my second book was a survey, really. It was based, not entirely, but probably 80 to 90% on secondary works. And there turned out to be a lot of Burgundy as examples, maybe more than some people would have expected, but I'd already started working on this other book at the same time. But a completely different experience from writing a dissertation. And I had, like many graduate students, the creative part is the research. You discover, you collate, you put various bits of information together. And then once you've done the brain work, the writing is pretty mechanical. Well, that's not true, obviously, if you're doing a dissertation, but the writing is just as much a part of the creative process. It may be clear in your head till you get it on paper. It may not be so clear. In fact, it usually doesn't seem nearly as convincing as it was in your head when you get it written down. But with a survey on the entire French Wars of Religion, when my only goal was to make it simple, something very complex with all these different civil wars, make it simplified for an undergraduate audience that has no background. The writing was obviously much more critical and had to go through several drafts. But Bill's undergrads giving feedback, that was just very useful. And I have to say, I wish I could inflict that on other undergraduates for other books, but it was just very useful and a very different writing experience, which I didn't expect to get early in my career. I thought that might be something that I would do later on. But I'm glad I went through it, and well, I'll leave it at that.
Yeah. Well, we all three have something in common in that regard with Bill, because
Right.
he signed all three of us up to write books for that series. Yours, I think, was, when was yours published?
1995.
So
first
same
edition.
year,
Same
yours,
month,
book on
yeah.
the state, and then on Artisans came out in 2000. So.
Yeah, my process was a lot different than Matt's, because Bill had asked me to do it at an AHA meeting. We were having a drink after going to a series to panels. And I had another book that I was just about, my Brittany book that I was just about finished with, so I was a little uncertain about whether I wanted to be doing a third book while I was trying to finish my second one. So I said, okay, but they made me do a prospectus. So I did a prospectus, which was sent to 3 outside readers. And 2 of them said, oh, this sounds great. And the third one says, what's he talking about? I smell absolutism in this. And I'm looking at it saying, it's got to be Roger Bennett, because associating me with absolutism doesn't make a whole lot of sense if you've ever read anything I wrote. All right, so then it goes out to 3 more people. And then 3 more.
my God.
And Roger kept fighting against it. So I finally ended up with 12 readers' reports of a prospectus, not a book. Right? And 11 of them all positive. And Roger met him holding out, and and I confronted him years after. I said, I know it was you, Roger. He says, oh yeah, it was good. But I just didn't want you to, I thought you would write too much absolutism. And if you've read Roger Medom's work, you know that he's just horrified by absolutism. And he's very defensive, but I forgave him. Yeah, he was seminal. I forgot, but then the writing process, I didn't get a chance to do that, but Bill interacted back and forth a lot. And he was writing one of his books at that time. He was writing the book on urban revolts, which also, like Professor Farr's work, focused on this whole question of honor. And Bill, as a Marxist, had moved away from a rather simplistic class conflict view of the urban revolts in France to understanding them more as a question of violation of social and cultural norms. And a lot of it had to do with people's sense of honor and the elites behaving in ways that they were expected to behave in violation of those norms, leading to revolts rather than some sort of simplistic class model, even though he was a historian very interested in social class and understood those dynamics behind the revolts as well, but that was not for him a very good answer. And I had totally forgotten that actually I was one of the readers for that, and Millie Beik brought it up in Pittsburgh. And then I also was the reader for his social and cultural history book, so we went back and forth a lot on that as well.
Well,
How did you,
Bill
your
was
process?
very smoothly. Bill was just a supremely kind man.
Mm-hmm.
But I want to tell a funny story from a guy who I grew to be dear friends with, who I wouldn't necessarily describe as a supremely kind man. But this is an interesting story for graduate students who eventually will produce a dissertation that may eventually become a first book. I finished my manuscript on Hands of Honor, sent it off to Cornell University Press. The editor liked it a lot. He sent it out to readers, and he said, well, one of the mandatory readers happens to be a faculty member here at Cornell. And he sits on the, you know what I'm talking about. He sits on the board, so we have to have him as one of the readers. This is Stephen Jones Kaplan. And he's one of the most trenchant critics. He and Eric Middleford, I think, maybe are the two that come to mind as being, wow. I mean,
They don't pull any punches.
They don't pull any punches, and they're sharp. They see things. Yeah. Well, so he gives it to 3 readers, I think. 2 come back, 2-page, 3-page report, whatever. Here comes the one back from Steve. 30 pages, single space. Starts out saying the author, needs to consider this, and he was clearly getting engaged because the tone of the report changed. And about halfway through, he's like, you need to do this, and you, exclamation point. He'd take an exclamation point and run it off the end of that. These are all typed, you know, they were just before the computer. He'd run them off the
all
end,
caps.
or he would, you know, he'd quote a statement I make, and then he'd just go, "Arg!" And I didn't know the guy. I knew his work, you know, and I thought, who is this? And the editor at Cornell said, now, you got to understand, we're dealing with a particular, you know, read a cat here. And at the very end, Steve puts a coda on it and says, "This is great. I think it's brilliant. I think you should publish it." And then I'm asking the editor at Cornell, what do I make of this? How am I supposed to revise a manuscript following this? And he says, well, I really thought about blacking out, you know, really irrelevant commentary, you know. He says, then I realized it'd be about 3/4 of it would be blacked out. And he said, and it's too priceless of a document not to share with you. Well, come on. I mean, I'm worried about getting tenure. I'm worried about getting this thing published. And I have thin skin. And I'm like, is this really what criticism in this profession is? And I wouldn't say Steve singular, but for every Steve, and Steve's a dear friend of mine. I'm not being hard on him at all. I've dedicated one of my books. He's really a master of histories of work and artisans, really. But for every Steve Kaplan, there's a Bill Beik.
Yeah.
Was he right in his comments?
Yes.
Oh,
Yeah. Oh, yes. Well, some of them were petty. Some of them were stylistic gripes he had. But the substance, oh yes, absolutely, the substantive. He was surprised. He didn't know I existed. And he was surprised that someone had spent 6 years, 7 years in the Dijon archives and had produced this, and it had somehow missed his, missed his attention. And we since then had become very close friends. But,
You saved the documents?
I'm sure I got it in my file somewhere. Yeah, yeah. But yeah, that was a little rough as a young scholar, and not really sure how to handle criticism.
I mean, one of the things that changed dramatically how we work in the archives since we both started in the 70s is technology. There were no laptops. There were no anytops. There weren't any computers. And you took notes by hand. And there were different ways people did it. People still use note cards, index cards. Others, various size bits of paper. And you come back from the archives and you have a box of paper. And to say it's not searchable is stating the obvious, although not entirely true. It's searchable by hand. You have to go through. And I'm even so much of an old fart that I typed up the final draft of my dissertation on a manual typewriter.
So did I.
And for you younger people, a typewriter.
There's a lot of whiteout.
Yeah, a lot of whiteout.
And by 1994, I had my first laptop that I took into the archives. And even in the mid-90s, archives were not yet accommodating scholars with computers. And you were kind of novelty. And in some places, like the municipal archives in Dijon, there were actually outlets under the table you could plug in if you needed to. And in 1994, talking about Jim preceded me by a year or two, and his first laptop was about this thick and weighed 12 pounds. But
he was the first person I ever saw with a laptop and what laptop? We were talking about
Yeah.
portable, not a laptop, a portable computer.
But the batteries were so primitive, they wouldn't hold a charge longer than about half an hour. So you had to plug it in. And the difference it made in terms of what you do in the archives, that is, you can generally type on a keyboard faster than you can write out. And of course there were no digital cameras then either. But the really good part of this was when you got back. If you took all your notes in Microsoft Word, it was all searchable and you could find things. And then, partly from your example, your statistical work in the Artisan's book, if you're taking statistics, whether price series or tax records, just open up a spreadsheet and enter it directly in, rather than typing it out in Word and then transferring it to a spreadsheet. That made a huge difference. And now, when I go into the archives, there are all these young people there with digital cameras, and they're just turning page up, photographing everything. Well, you don't need film. There's no maximum that you can do. And then when you get home, you spend time and go through it and read it. And I understand it is now harder to get to the archives and spend time there because of cost. Back in the mid-'80s, 10 francs to the dollar. This was pre-Euro. And just to give you a reference point, in the summer of '85, I had an NEH summer stipend of $3,000. Well, I'd never stayed and rented an apartment in Paris. I'd always stayed at the Cité Universitaire, where you're renting a dorm room and sharing a bathroom with like 50 other people, because it was cheap. And that summer, my wife and I rented an apartment that seemed like a luxury. It was small, but going to the archives every day. In fact, a restaurant around the corner, you could get a 3-course meal for 32 francs, which at 10 francs to the dollar, you can see a little over $3. So we were eating out every night. At the end of the summer, I was there for 3 months. I had $400 left. I couldn't spend it. Well, those days are gone, and it's harder. I understand that. I don't. I use digital camera myself, but the experience of encountering face-to-face the actual document seems to me too important to abandon altogether. I know in the Burgundy book that has just been published, I make a big to-do in the introduction about trying to combine material culture with politics and religion, and saying you can't really separate them out and treat them separately. And historians have always made a fetish, if you're an archive rat at least, of documents in the archives, because that's the coalface where you learn what was going on. But I never really realized until relatively late that these documents are also material objects. While ancient historians rely almost exclusively on material artifacts, medieval historians use them a good deal, even though they have no text. Early modernists tend not to put much weight onto objects, and I think that's very short-sighted. And when you consider a document in the archive as a material object, you treat it not just as information that you're trying to read the handwriting and copy down. It's an artifact, and who created it, and what format is it? A lot of archives have digitalized a lot of their holdings, and in Burgundy, the État Civil, all the baptismal records are now online. But you don't get any sense of size. It's all screen size. You don't know if there are things written either in the margins that are left off or on the back of the page. You don't know what has been inserted into that same volume that might be different. I just still think, and maybe this is just me being old-fashioned, archival work, coming face-to-face with the documents, is still important, because you do encounter and learn more about the past than just reading the same text on a computer screen or online, because the archive is digitalized them. And I know some of you, in Suquan, you spent last year in Normandy, you've come face-to-face with a lot of documents. It's a learning experience. Never mind the difference in working with the staff, who are just so much friendlier. Not because they're unfriendly in Paris, the whole myth.
I can think of a few présidents de la salle. I'm sure you encountered. Don't even turn on the lights.
Yeah, well, I found it's opening windows.
Oh, well, yeah.
In the heat of July and August, they just won't open them.
Yeah.
But in the provinces, once they see you coming in every day for a couple of weeks, they know you're serious, and they want to know more about you, and they help you out. In the municipal archives in Dijon, they would photocopy whatever I asked them, wouldn't charge me anything. One day I turned up with a cold, and they brought me some medicament. And finally, when I've been going there several summers, one of the staff there brought me a bottle of homemade crème de cassis. And when I was there in '93, '94, at the end of the year, they all took me out to lunch. This isn't going to happen in Paris. And as you said earlier, they put you onto things that aren't in the inventories. And some stuff they don't even know. Here's a box, look through this. So get that experience. And even if you can't spend long periods of time, spend most of your time, if you're only there for 3 months, spend 2.5 months going through documents, your last 2 weeks just photographing everything you haven't seen. But get that experience. I think it's still, it's part of what historians do. And there are plenty of historians who only use printed sources. 19th, 20th century historians writing about current events. Yeah.
May I ask a follow-up question?
Sure.
Yeah, so
So could everybody identify yourself
Sure.
as you ask questions?
I'm a 7th year here. I actually do Middle East history. And I've been to the archive and come back. And something that I notice now among graduate students is that because of this technology, we're kind of expected to come back with tons and tons of documents that we haven't read yet that we can save and use for later projects. And I wonder conceptually, related to this technology, if you see long-term changes in the types of research that's being produced and the types of questions that are being asked and the types of trajectories. Maybe it's too soon to tell, but of people's career, because it is just such a different pattern of travel and writing, and also the timeline of when you read and process, I think, changes so much with this photographic technology. I wonder, from your perspective, if you're seeing those changes manifest themselves in the types of arguments and analyses that people are making in their scholarship.
That question is probably best posed to the people coming in the spring, the later generations, because we're pretty old-fashioned in the.
You students, and you see them.
I have one student that is in France, and he's trying to, insisted that you follow the old-fashioned model, and that is stay over there and immerse yourself in the archives as long as you can, and he's fortunate to have enough funding to be able to do that. Now I worry that I may have lost him, and he's got native on me. I'm not sure he's going to come home. I'm not sure he's going to finish the dissertation, but I impressed upon him what Mack was saying about the importance of immersing yourself in the archives. I'm sure it will change things, because I know there are financial demands that make that the way you have to do research, and it's not like you're not going to actually read the documents, but if you, the more time you can spend in a surplus, there, things turn up that you just won't get through photographs, just pure serendipity. That book happened because of pure chance. The Tale of Two Murders. I was doing research on the Authority and Sexuality book, and I had seen some offhand reference somewhere, I can't remember where, about a book that had referenced a trial that was about adultery. I thought, okay, I'm doing a book on sexuality and authority. I might want to take a look at that. So I was sitting in the municipal library, and I had time to kill. Closed at 5. And I was done looking at the stuff I wanted to around 4, a little after 4, and I knew I could request documents to be brought to me until 4:15. So I thought, I'm going to take a peek at this thing and just kind of buzz through it 45 minutes and see if there's anything there for me. So I wrote down the call number, sent them on. Magazine EA comes back in about 10 minutes, and he's got this huge folio book. It's this big, it's that thick. Boom, plops it on my table, and the devil it says. I opened it up, and it was an 18th century copy of many of the key documents of this particular trial. And yes, there was adultery in it, but that was incidental. And I was like, whoa, this is a lot bigger than buzzing through this in 45 minutes. So I did what Carlo Ginzburg did when he encountered Pinocchio while he was studying the witches of the Benedante, which is the Friuli. I'll set this aside, and maybe there's a book here subsequent. So I didn't use it for that book, but I just, you know, just happened to be there, have the time to look at it, and then follow a new trail. And this, everybody I taught this, you've had this experience, everybody who works in the archives has this experience. That there's stuff there you didn't know, you stumble.
They don't know.
They don't know, you stumble upon things, and it opens up whole new worlds, whole new paths. I'm not criticizing the new photographic technology and that method of research, but it'd be harder to have those kinds of experiences, I think, with that kind of recorded documentation. But I don't know, if I mean, do you have any sense of what, how it's affecting?
You can give the example here because the person's in the room, right? So same story, I'm in the archive, it's after 4 o'clock, I'm done. But, you know, it says in the catalog, this in Trépas de la Loi, 1651, which was a small duty collected on behalf of one of the churches in Nantes. So, well, maybe I can get some statistical information. Turns out, it's the Port Register of Nantes of 1631, so it's miscatalogued. It's the only surviving port register for any Atlantic port in France between 1600 and 1690. So I used it to write an article, and Henriette used it as the core of writing her dissertation, which she turned into her book, Spirit Exchange, about the relationship between Rotterdam and Nantes. It's probably the most important
Wine and brandy trade.
wine and brandy trade, and that's probably the most important French document
Oh,
in
absolutely.
your
Yeah.
whole dissertation. So her core of her dissertation came out of me just sitting in the archive.
Coattails.
The only person who had seen this document before me was a Breton historian, a wonderful guy now deceased named Jean Tanguy. And I was sitting in Jean's house one day and we were talking about this document. And I said to him, Jean, how did you come across this document? He said, well, I was sitting in the archive one day, it was about 4:30. So you're not going to do that just...
Yeah.
And so I do think that's a critical part of this. To me in the archives, what I see when I see people taking too many pictures, there are certain types of documents where I think that's the right approach, right? I mean, for instance, if you're doing tax rolls, take pictures by all means. There are other types of documents where that's not a very good idea, in my opinion. You're much better off going through the document, sitting there, analyzing it as you're going through it, taking notes. It's training you better as a historian, and it's also a much more effective way to get to that document. That's my personal, Tom, that you're shaking your head.
Well,
Yes, so this is Tom
I think-
Kaiser,
I'm
great
Kaiser.
18th century historian.
Thanks. Yeah, I don't take too many pictures because I have to go through lots and lots of correspondence, which is not terribly interesting. So, but sometimes you find something by reading it on site that then redirects your research,
Yes.
which you wouldn't have gotten if I had taken a photograph of it and gone home and then suddenly realized later, after reading it at home, oh my gosh, I really missed an opportunity here to look into something, because it sends you off into another area. That's why it's laborious, you don't get through as much material, but sometimes it has that feedback advantage, that it can then you know where to look at something that you might not have otherwise looked for.
Can I follow up with something that Max said, of also that the people in the archive are an incredible resource, and if you're not sort of using them, if you're spending a lot of time just sort of focusing on taking pictures of everything and getting out, you lose that resource. And so lots of times when you're looking through things, I mean, and for paleography, for trying to understand words and things, they know it and they've been working with it, and then you read something and that they're like, oh, I had no idea what that was, and I would have been struggling at home with it for days and weeks. They can help you right away, and then they're like, oh, and that will connect with this, that then brings you that other document. And especially in the provinces, I worked in Strasbourg, and it's just, they love you coming in all the time, and I was the only person in there for so long, and they're like, oh, it's so good that you're coming, not the Germans who always come here. Yeah, we really want the Americans, and the French can't read the documents because it's all in German, so they love that, and they would open up early for me, they would let me stay during lunch, they would let me Xerox things on my own, just take it back to them. They say, oh, how many pages did you do, and things. So you build up this relationship that is one of the wonderful things about doing this, and that they want to help you, and they're so excited to help you read the stuff.
Turn over here to Don Sutherland. I don't know how many of you recognize him. Great specialist on the French Revolution.
University of Maryland. One of the things I'm going to make a case for photographs, searchable documents, PDFs, all that, make the case that they're better. They're better than the old method. Because one of the things you do when you sit in the archives taking notes, and believe me, I have taken lots of notes. I have a barrage full of notes. Because you can tell by the way here, that's the generation of these guys, the same thing. But one of the things that you can do with the photographs and with reproducible, searchable documents is find things you wouldn't otherwise find. Because when you take notes, you censor. You think that certain things aren't very important as you go through. And I'll give you an example of something, because I just finished it today. Threats to kill Louis XVI in 1789. Unheard of. You've never read that anywhere. You can look that up anywhere. Threats to kill Louis XVI. You come across that when you're writing it down, taking notes, you think, oh, fluke, the guy's crazy. Then you come across a second, then your photographs, you come across a second threat, third threat. It's all the same thing. You are going to think, there were people in the middle of Paris in 1789 who were threatening to kill the king. That's incredibly important. And you wouldn't have found it otherwise unless you had these more or less new methods. So there are advantages and disadvantages to all methods of doing it. I'm a great archival person.
Yeah.
I've had a wonderful experience in archives. I think archives are better now than they ever were. And the reason is that the État civil is online, and so the genealogists are no longer there. Because they can do it online, and the archivists now have time for you. And you can check them up and find out things, and this is even true in the Archives Nationales, where Président de la Salle, they used to be beasts, this is true, you're quite right, they used to be awful people.
Censor that part.
Nowadays, the Archives Nationales, they will come up to you and ask what you're doing, or they find out what you're doing, and say, come with me, I've got something to show you. So the archival experience is better than it was 30 years ago when I started.
The genealogists were terrible. When I was
They
first
separated
in,
out and stuff, so they didn't get to
well, I was in Brittany before the craze started, and it started in France, in Brittany, in the mid-70s. And you were probably experienced this because you were working a lot of times. And all these genealogists would come in. And I was the only person in the room who could read 17th century handwriting. And so I would be interrupted every 5 minutes by some sweet little old lady who would come over, and the Président de la Salle would say, well, you know, that crazy looking guy over there with the long hair and the basketball sneakers. And so it made it very difficult to work, actually. And then you would go and all the chairs would be taken, and I had the experience in Bourges where I came in, they found out I was a real researcher, and the main archivist threw his chief assistant out of his office so that a real researcher could have a space to work. So yes, it's wonderful that they've put it all online.
I just want to say something about genealogist Joanne Moran Cruz. I'm here at Georgetown. So I could not, however, have read through 10,000 wills online, you know, by microfilm actually, if it weren't for the Mormon Church.
The Mormons.
Oh, yes.
And I mean, I didn't have the luxury of sitting in an archive in Northern England and reading 10,000 wills. I had to do it through the local ward stake on film. And so I do want to put in a good word for genealogists because otherwise it wouldn't have been possible.
Sure, I've used their stuff too. Somebody had a hand in here. I couldn't see. What are you going to call it?
You got a follow-up, Middle East.
Oh,
Follow-up question?
yeah, I wanted to maybe also ask my question a different way. So now when we apply for jobs and postdocs, we have to have a second project lined up, right? And I wonder if that comes out of the fact that there's this expectation of coming back with photographs for so much more than we can possibly use for the dissertation. And how that will impact kind of the rate of production that's expected, the chances for what you're talking about with the serendipity in the archives. And I just wonder if you have thoughts on the direction hiring processes have taken and expectations of production and how you think that might shape scholarship in the future.
I'm not sure that's that new. I remember explicitly being coached for my first job interview by Sarah Mazza saying, okay, this is a question you're going to get. Your hands of honor, okay, that's been put to bed, what's next?
Okay.
And you don't, so you need to be engaged, and that typically would be a tenure. I mean, it isn't just having a book to get tenure, you have to have evidence of continuing scholarly engagement. In other words, what's your next project? So that was already going on in the 80s. Maybe before that, for all I know, but those expectations were already there. And I'm not sure, have those changed?
No, but I would point out that the significance of the question isn't the specific project or that you have something already in mind. It's to demonstrate that you're not going to stop working once you get tenure, that you're going to continue throughout your career to be a practicing, engaged scholar. So I don't think anybody can know what their second project is going to be until you start doing it, which isn't really, you're not fully engaged in that until you finish your first project. But you need some kind of evidence that you're going to be an engaged scholar, not just until you get tenure. They want to see some evidence that you are focused on this for a career, that this is what you want to do. And to go back to your original question, I would just offer a different kind of answer. How does the technology change what you do over the course of a career? I think a lot of it has to do with how comfortable you are in living in a foreign country, working in a foreign language. I mean, all of us. First time I went to France to do research, show up at the archives, I couldn't read a thing. I could barely tell it was in French. And I was just sort of going through pages. I want to find a document I can read. I'm going to take notes on that, no matter what it's
That determines your topic.
I was just looking for stuff I could read. And after I'd been there a month or so, it got a little easier, and then a little easier. And by the second time I went back, it was much easier. But I have a friend who's now retired. He preceded me at Emory by about 6 or 7 years, named Jim Wood. He wrote a book on the army of Charles IX. And the closest thing to a military historian I knew at the time. He hated going to France. He hated archival research.
And conferences.
Yeah. He was just so uncomfortable speaking French. He couldn't understand anything. He could ask a question, he couldn't understand the response. He just hated being there. And the Army of Charles IX was his second book. He had done a dissertation on the Généralité of Bayeux.
Yeah, the nobility of the élection.
And for the Army of Charles IX, he went to Paris once, put in a microfilm order for everything he was going to need for the book. He taught at Williams College, which must have had an unending budget, research budget. They paid for all of this. He showed me a closet full of microfilm when I visited his office. He hated going to France. The technology that's now available would work for someone like that. I love going to France. I love going into the archives. I love doing that kind of work. And I take advantage of the technology. I have a digital camera and wouldn't consider going without a laptop now. But depending on your own, I think, personality as a scholar, it can make a huge difference, a little difference, or anywhere in between. I mean, ultimately, we can't say technology is this, it's just always changing. And will continue to change. So, I mean, I hope we never get to a day, although it would be good in a lot of ways, if every document in every archive was online. But I'd hate to think, oh, nobody's going to allow me to go into the archives. And now when stuff, I mean, you mentioned the Mormons, they've taken all of the État Civil everywhere in France, and they've microfilmed it. And a lot of archives won't let you look at the originals anymore.
That's happened also with the Prerogative Court of Canterbury.
Right.
I can make a case for myself because I've used these documents so much, but for an ordinary scholar coming in, they're not allowed to see the original documents anymore.
That's one case where personal things matter a lot, because at Arsenal, where I've worked quite a bit, they'll let me see the originals. They have to get special permission, because anything that's been microfilmed there must be read on microfilm. You cannot have the original. It's not just État Civil, it's all kinds of manuscripts. But most of the time, they'll let me actually have the manuscript. Why? Because you know the people back to the stuff that you're talking about. And if you just walk in the door, it's not going to happen. I want to go back to the point that Don raised, though, about I think we can do a lot of different kinds of research now because of this. You can have different topics. Not only what you do in the archives, like taking pictures, like Don was talking about, but the stuff that's online, for instance, all three of us have used the Recherche des Feux in the Archives départementales of the Côte d'Or, which are these hearth investigations that were done about every 10 years. Remember Mack joking in 1986 that every time he opened one of those, there was a note in there that I had already been there. And copied these pages, right? All right, so we were using the same documents. Those are all now online. And so you then would have, you have access to them. One of the things that is there, which has not been used by anybody yet, for example, is that in 2 of the 8 bailiwicks, the inspector decided he would do a housing census in 1610 as his investigation of the horse. He lists every house, who lives in it, what their profession is, and whether they rent or own. And if they rent, he lists the name of the owner and the owner's profession. So you can create these massive statistical things of did vignerons own their own houses, did artisans own their houses, not only in Dijon, but in small towns, right? There are probably between 60 and 100,000 houses. So this is, there's nothing like this that I know of any place else in Europe. A massive scale. And under the old technology, it would have been literally impossible to do anything with that. Whereas now, back to Don's point, this can be certain you can do all kinds of stuff with this. That is really quite extraordinary. I mean, you have to be able to read the handwriting, but that's enough. Elizabeth, this is Elizabeth
Henry
Ross.
has a question.
Oh, Henriette.
Well, I have a follow-up on the second project, so if this is a direct follow-up for.
Yes, mine's a direct
All right,
follow-up.
so this is Elizabeth Cross, who's brand new at Georgetown, those of you who've met her.
Thank you. So as a recently minted PhD, I would like to follow Don and jump gleefully onto the digital bandwagon, because I found especially the ability to take photographs really helped broaden my horizons in the archives rather than constricting them, just because it made it more feasible to jump down rabbit holes and take a chance. Because basically, like, okay, so one of my principal archives was the Colonial Archives in Aix-en-Provence. You are capped at 6 documents a day. Whether they take five minutes or an entire day, you only get 6 a day. So if you're only going to be there for a couple of weeks, you have to budget, like, very, very carefully. So am I going to only look at 1 document per day, or can I cap that out at 6 every single day? And what it allowed me to do, I mean, I still had the same kinds of sort of transformative experiences with individual documents, it just had to happen much faster. So you have to process very quickly, is this something that's going to make a difference? Is it something that I never want to see again? And then make the decision, well, am I going to allocate an entire day, potentially an entire week, to read through everything, or can I allocate an hour or 2 to photograph everything and then take it home with me and read it at my own time? And I definitely, because of that ability to take those photographs, I was able to process things in a very different way and absorb little moments that ended up being really important that I wouldn't have gotten if I had to rush through a carton in the course of a single day in order to place another order. So there are advantages. I mean, what I always tell people is that you should never take a photo of something when you don't know what it is. And that sounds really stupid, but I knew a lot of people who dug themselves into enormous rabbit holes where they'd come back from the archives with 80,000 photos. They had no idea what any of it was in retrospect. But as long as you have sort of a clear finding aid that you make for your own purpose of every box that you look at, you can be very smart organizationally in terms of locating new things. And yeah, so I follow onto the digital bandwagon.
Well, this is why people of your generation are so much better than we are.
We took microfilms, which we never looked at. We had Robinson, who's a Georgetown PhD.
My follow-up is regarding, okay, how do you get to your second project? I was looking at wine, I was looking at brandy, I was looking at merchants in both in the Netherlands and in France. And in the course, or over the course of that project, a group of Sephardic Jewish merchants in both places started to gel a little bit. So the big discussion Jim and I had, or Professor Collins I should say, because he was my dissertation advisor at the time, was do I take the Sephardim out and that will be the core of my next book, or do I keep them in and basically waste a second book on, or incorporate it? And the decision, and I'm still convinced it was the right one, is to keep it in because they were part of that story. But I did tell a story I might have been able to put into a second book. I dealt with it in the first book. So I think you have to sometimes be on the lookout for such a second project, and then it's your decision to say, am I sacrificing this great source or side source onto the first one?
Here in Georgetown, John McNeil always asks this question. In every search he's ever on, he always asks, what's your next project? And then he'll ask, have you thought about anything beyond that? And it's just, as Mack Holt said, it's just a way to get some sense of how you think about things and how you might be conceptualizing further work, rather than, okay, what is this based on, and a really in-depth. Most people usually ask a little bit of follow-up questions to see how far along you are with that second project, whether you have, as you just pointed out, a base that from your first project that's going to be developed. But it goes back, I mean, we all face that question way back when Tom, and then Tom Adams, who's former NEH and author of a fine book on French borderless.
Yeah. It's years since I've been in an archive, and work I've been doing is mostly secondary works, and I've just been amazed with what you can get online, and it really is a tremendous boon. But one question I would ask all of you, because I don't know what the state of the archives is, but are there substantial bodies of archives that are not online and maybe never will be? And I'm thinking particularly relating to poor relief is the just absolutely enormous volume of documents about hospitals in France.
Mm-hmm.
And they are underutilized, basically,
Mm-hmm.
and terribly rich. But I doubt, are they being put online? I don't think so.
I have not seen evidence, I don't particularly look at
I
hospitals.
think we're looking forward to a day where something like that can happen. I know one of my favorite places to go, nicest archive in France, one of the most difficult cities to live in, Laval, is the Archives départementales de la Mayenne, or a very friendly relationship with the archivist. They took me one day to say, Donald, come see what we've got. The French are very technologically hidden. And she said, look at what this is. It's the whole of Series L, that's the revolutionary series from 1789 to 1799, all of it digitized.
Well,
And the advantage, she said, find something. I said, well, I want Fouché, because Fouché is the Police Minister of Police, but he was a représentant mission in year 2, and he roared through the Mayenne, and I want to see what he wrote. And Fouché's handwriting is extremely difficult, and here's the advantage again for a digital thing. You can do with Fouché's handwriting and his letters, you can find them very easily, and you can blow them up. And you can see, you can decipher the handwriting so much easier than it is in real life. So I said, what are you going to do with this? It's all digitized. You're going to put it online? I said, we haven't decided yet. Because it was a great thing to do. We had the technology and we decided to do it.
I'm an older fart than these other old farts. I first went to Paris in '67 with a dissertation that I was going to work on, that I got a Woodrow Wilson Dissertation Fellowship on, the legend of Henri Cat. There were no finding aids. Printed finding aids didn't exist. The Bibliothèque Nationale catalog was only up to the letter, I think, S. So I got there and I started trying to find stuff, and I wound up abandoning my dissertation while I was there. By the way, I was there on Europe on $5 a day, and I actually made it on $5 a day on those days. But I wound up getting a dissertation thanks to my advisors having just come back from the Second International Congress on the Enlightenment, where somebody did a paper on the Jansenists and said, nobody has written on the Commissionnaire. And he said, when he came back, he said, why don't you look in the archive and the Bibliothèque Nationale tomorrow and see what's there? And the rest is, for me, history, and that's how I started this project. But it's so different. I mean, I'm astonished. I was going to be working on the history of the emergence of the veterinary medical profession, and did a paper on that before I bowed out of the profession, as it were. And by the time I was working on that in the 80s, there were already things, finding aids and documents online, but the experience of working in the 60s was just so different. I mean, I envy those of you who now have these, at least the finding aids, quite apart from the materials that are online.
I think one of the dangers, back to the point Don just raised, is that for example, in France, some of the municipal archives are very proactive in putting this stuff online. Like Rennes and Brittany has put an enormous amount of material online. Dijon, which has wonderful archives, the city has put virtually nothing online. The departmental archives has put a lot of stuff online. And I think one of the dangers we have is that that's going to drive a lot of future research. That the stuff that's available online, much like in our day, one of the reasons people worked a lot on Burgundy is that the two places back in the 70s where there were published documents that were readily, easily accessible in your graduate seminar, there was a lot of stuff, if you were looking at peasants, on southwestern France, in Yves-Marie Bercet's book, Histoire des Coqons, the second volume was all documents. And Pierre de Saint-Jacob had published a volume of documents on Burgundy, right? And all of us had read this, about Burgundian peasants and all of this stuff, and we knew a little bit about Burgundian archives before we went there. And I don't think it's a coincidence that those two regions have drew subsequently a lot of American scholars. Where, back to your point, I think that's going to happen a lot with digital archives, that certain places that are very proactive and make things available to us are going to draw a lot more attention and research, and other places are going to be more wide open for research just because they're not made available.
That's going to skew history.
I think so.
Yeah, I do want to say that for people with families, to travel to Europe, to spend months in the archives, when you've got small children, the digitalization is really opening it up to people who might not have been able to, for family reasons, to get there. Also, the fact that you can take the materials home at night, and you're not just limited to 9 to 4:30.
Exactly.
That you can keep working on it through the evening and early morning is another fantastic benefit of copying, digitalizing, etc. But I do want to just go back and remember when I microfilmed a lot and sent it by boat back to Boston, and somebody thought, I think, that this was more interesting than Latin medieval art, I don't know what they thought they had, but they stole it.
Oh, no.
And I often thought about what happened when they finally put it up to see what it was. and it meant that I changed my topic, because I was originally going to look at the Port of Hull and ports in England, and I completely had to change my archives. And I remember colleagues sending work back from Latin America in paper, and it never arrived. All the research they had done. So that was one of the hazards of trying to do research in the 60s, 70s. Before digitalization. Now you are able to preserve things so much better. Just remind you of that.
Notice how two of our speakers changed their dissertation topic while they were working on it. And so those of you who actually haven't gotten all that far in your dissertation, don't be put off too far by that. I changed mine as well a little bit. I was originally going to do Normandy and Brittany, and like Mack, when I went there, I was a total idiot. And I had no idea when I went to Rouen-Caen what I had actually seen in the archives. In Rouen, there was plenty of stuff, but I was too dumb to know it. And in Caen, there was no place to live. We couldn't get an apartment. So I ended up only doing Brittany, partly because I wasn't really aware of what was there in Normandy, which I discovered when I went back. There was plenty of stuff, but I just didn't know enough of where to look for it. It wasn't in the place that I had assumed it was going to be. It was in a different part of the archive. Well, that was lack of training and lack of familiarity. If I'd spent some time there, I might have learned that. But a lot of us, I don't know, did your topic migrate a bit when you were working on it?
In seminar, I was preparing a topic that was not listed because it was a Harvard dissertation on Langay by Darlene Levy. So I broadened it to Économie Cité, and having started some of the issues with one topic, but then changing them.
How did yours evolve, Don? Did you
Started off at the University of London studying with Alfred Common.
Right.
And those are the days when social history, we were all analysts, told the story, work from below and so on. And the big hot book when I first got to London was Charles Tilly's Vendée.
Right. Yeah. Sure.
All of the reviews of Tilly's Vendée said that it's a great book, a wonderful book, and all the rest. But I had one gap, which it didn't have the mentalité aspect of it. So I thought, I'm going to do mentalité. To do mentalité, and I knew where I was going to find the source too, which was in the military records of the people who, of the courts that tried the Chouans and peasant counter-revolutionaries. And there are hundreds and hundreds of these individuals who were caught before a court. Not one of them talked about his mentalité. That's because being a peasant counter-revolutionary royalist was a crime. Punishable by death. Within 24 hours, we're dealing with the French Revolution terror here. 24 hours without appeal. So what the peasant would say, the prosecutor would say, how did you get into this? And said, well, I was misled by the priest. That's a check, that's good. That's good, that's all I can believe. And the other one was, I was drunk.
Pretty much covered it.
That was a check, and it said I was released. So I had to rejig the whole thing. The mentalité, I kept a little file going called mentalité, and through the piece of paper in the mentalité file, whenever I came across something that did, that eventually became a couple of pages in the book. It was not a whole book, that's for sure. And then I moved from Van to Brittany to Rennes, which has a better archive than Van did, and moved on from there.
You missed the third one, the drunk priest.
Some people redirect their research on, because of the inability to, particularly in the earlier period, to read the hand. John Tedeschi, who was the director of the Renaissance Center at the Newberry Library, had his dissertation topic and documents and all that, got over and couldn't read a word. And so he had to abandon it and on the fly come up with a new topic. I didn't really know what to expect, but I had the just dumb luck of having been in Chicago in the summer of 1980 when the Newberry was launching their paleographic training seminars. And I was at Northwestern, and Bill Monter said, you need to get down there and learn how to read this handwriting. And I said, why? I mean, he said, just wait. Wait till you get to France and look at this chicken scratch. And so, sure enough, when I got to France and looked at that, particularly some of the notarial, because they're writing real fast. I mean, it's like, it looks like Arabic. I mean, and if I had not had that training, I would have had Tedeschi's experience. I thought, I got a problem.
You were in that seminar, right?
Sorry?
Were you in that seminar?
No, Carlos Ayer was in it. I think who else? Bernard Barbiche taught it.
Right, yeah, because I took one with him later, and Lee and Jacob took one this summer with Mark Smith who took the place of Emmanuel Coude.
Yeah.
Barbiche was replaced by Fonse, one of his students. Ashley, did you do that? You did the one 3 or 4 years ago with Mark Smith also, right? So did Sylvia Mullins, I think, did one as well. So
And Calvin College runs one.
Calvin College actually did that one as well,
Lambert.
right?
Yes.
So yeah, that's something that if you're working on this period in early modern, you need the paleographic.
We've talked about technological change from when we started and where you are now. Another huge change is an attitudinal change. And that is, several of you were talking, Lee and Suquan and Nate, about putting together a panel for French Historical Studies meeting in Indianapolis next year. Well, in the 1970s, graduate students, we weren't allowed on panels for one thing.
Up to the 1990s,
Yeah.
FHS, the Western did, but FHS did not allow graduates.
My supervisor in grad school at Emory, he said, we're not paying you to give conference papers, we're paying you to finish your dissertation. So the attitude was, you give a conference paper, that's just going to slow you down.
Right.
And even when you finished your PhD, unless you had a patron, it was still difficult to get on the program of French Historical Studies, of the AHA. Again, the Western was different. They were much more open.
That's how they came into being in the first place.
Yeah. So that's a huge change. And certainly, I know all of you are aware of the advantages of being able to get feedback. And it's the feedback from other people. The same way I got feedback from Bill Beik's undergraduates. And when you're working on something, getting positive criticism that it's good to know you're going down a rabbit hole or you're moving in the wrong direction. It's good to know. It's not fun to receive criticism. Usually at conferences, you don't get the full full frontal Steve Kaplan.
Once in a while I get the full front
Yes.
of Joel Chappelle.
Yeah, yeah.
I got that go over the full front, so it's same sort of thing.
Yeah, my very first conference presentation, I finished my dissertation, my first job, a one-year position at UNC Wilmington, which is now being threatened by storm. And it was at French Historical Studies in Charlottesville, and I submitted a paper proposal, and I get put together on a panel with other people. The whole panels were pretty rare back then, particularly from people my age. And it ended up on a panel with two very good scholars, John DeWald and Claire Dolan, Canadian. But the commentator was George Hubbard. And Russell Major warned me, although only days before the conference began. He said, he's probably going to give you a hard time. And I said, why? And he said, well, I trashed his latest book on he was very critical about my paper and John DeWald's paper, and he was very positive about Claire's paper. And that was, first presentation, and I mean, I wasn't expecting it, even though I'd gotten this warning. I said, oh, it'll be constructive criticism. Well, not really. But when the questions were opened up, and there must have been 50 people in the room. I mean,
I was in the room, so I
but
can attest to this whole story.
people who are already established in the field that I had never even met, and I met for the first time not just John and Claire. I'd already met you in Albuquerque the fall before at the Western, but Barbara Diefendorf and Sharon Kettering and John Salmon, and anyway, when it was thrown open to questions, this short little man in the back raised his hand, and the chair called on him, and he stood up and said in French, "Je suis Pierre Goubert." But he then walked up to the front of the room and took the podium to give his comment, and he then proceeded to say positive things about John's paper and my paper, and I felt a whole lot better.
No.
But things are different now. I mean, you get to present as graduate students, you're encouraged to. The feedback is just very, very useful. And as I tell my students, it's only going to slow your dissertation down if you're doing something completely off topic. If you can present something out of your dissertation, or that can be an idea or a draft for a chapter, then it's not going to slow you down. You'll get the professional interaction, the experience of meeting other people, and you see your peers who are in the same stage you are and what they're working on. But that's really different. Yes, there are more women in the profession, and that's a good thing. Had we been doing this 30 years ago, it would have been primarily male. And so the world is changing. You might not always be aware of that if you're looking down Pennsylvania Avenue these days, but the profession has changed a lot, and we'll continue to do so.
Questions from that end of the table? You've all been reading their work, some of which you've read before, I know. You meet old Professor Beik. Ashley Corwin is one of our graduate students.
For Professor Holt, so for your dissertation on the Duke of Anjou, I feel like it seems to me today a graduate student couldn't get away with writing a biography like that for their dissertation. How do you think? What advice would you give to new students writing dissertations about the changing landscape of what is expected for a dissertation?
Well, you want to write something that other people are going to want to read. There's no point in writing something if only 6 people in the world are going to end up reading it. And so you want in some way to engage with some question or topic or interest that other scholars in your field have. If you're just writing to please yourself or just you and your supervisor and 6 other people, To me, that's not a good reason for writing a dissertation. On the other hand, I'd also say, when you're writing a dissertation, this has to be something you are really interested in, and you're not going to become bored with it halfway through, or you may not finish. And I guess it's not so much what you can get away with. What can you convince yourself or be convinced that other people might be interested in this? I guess I became a French historian accidentally. I never took French in high school. I'd done Spanish and Latin, and only after I took a Western Civ class, because it was a requirement, I wasn't even a history major. I started out at Georgia Tech and studying architecture. When I decided I liked designing buildings, I didn't really care whether they could actually be built or stand up. It was all the physics and mechanics and calculus that put me off. I love the design classes. I transferred across town to Georgia State, and I had to take all these general education required classes that Georgia Tech didn't even have. And I was assigned to this Western Civ class my first semester, and I was just mesmerized by the professor. And that's scary when you're a professor, that you can affect somebody that positively and that negatively. But I just never found, in high school, history was taught by a baseball coach and a basketball coach, and it never crossed my mind I wanted to major in history. So I became a French historian by accident because this guy was a French historian. I said, I'll take another class with him, and it was on the Reformation and one on early modern Europe, and he worked on France, and I started taking French. But I got suggested this topic. He said, well, no one's ever focused on Anjou. He seemed to be important. Contemporaries thought it was important, but now nobody thinks he's important. Why is that? But it has to be a subject you're into, and that you find some evidence that other people are interested in.
What I meant by that was that in today's landscape, how do you, sorry, let me rephrase my question. How do you straddle the line between writing something that you're really interested in and that other people are interested in without falling into the trap of writing something because it's popular right now?
Well, academic books aren't popular ever.
Well, popular within our atmosphere.
I mean, this is one of the Achilles heels of academics. We write for each other. And it's rare to break out and really write something that's good, that attracts a wider audience. Some people can do it. Microhistory has proven in our lifetime to be one way to do it, not the only way. But I think we also have to get beyond our biases and prejudices that if it's popular, it's bad, or political history is bad. I encountered a book recently you may have come across by Michael Lewis, more well known for writing Moneyball about baseball, and he's written lots of books, but this one was called The Undoing Project, and it's about statistics and cognitive psychology, and he just sort of flayed the historical profession. He says, historians are guilty of two biases. We're guilty of hindsight bias, because we know what happened, and then we look in all these scattered documents, many of which are just have survived randomly rather than systematically, and we see patterns, and we write narratives based on these patterns. Well, that's what we do. But he said, we're writing about random stuff, and we're seeing patterns in it because, in hindsight, we know how the story ended. And then we're guilty of also confirmation bias, because once we have a pattern, we're going to just latch on to any information that supports it and just kind of tune out the information that really contradicts that bias. So just go with what attracts you, what attracts other scholars. If it happens to be popular with the general public, that's great. You might make some money off of it, unlike academic monographs. But what is popular what is academically fashionable, it just changes so quickly. And now, you know, at the École des Hautes Études, nobody's doing Annelise's total history anymore. In fact, you know, Robert Desimon and Christiane Drouot, they made politics very popular. And, you know, the flavor of the month.
Studying families.
Yeah.
I mean, they're sort of biographies, if you think about it, you know. What's his name, Eddie Haddad's book on the Belin is over in the library, so it's a kind of a family study. But back to the point that Elizabeth and Don raised about the digital stuff, this is where this confirmation bias, you can fight against it much more easily in a digital way than you can in the old-fashioned way, because you can do word searches, and they're going to pop up all of a sudden the word that you didn't think was being used very much, it turns out it was used a lot more than you thought. And that's the kind of thing that digital access now really can help us prevent some of these sorts of problems. I mean, you can do the bad way by just searching the words that you wanted and ignoring all the other ones. You can do that too, but if you're being honest about it, you can now get a much more accurate view of this universe of texts. And many of them, of course, are these 16th, 17th century printed texts are online now and easily searchable, although I will say, for those of you who've worked on them, the searchable elements are often highly inaccurate. Some of these things, like Google Books, you know, it's not always accurate within the text. You have to be very careful of that. And the typefaces in early modern books often throw these things off as well. And so I would caution you about overly relying on it, I would have to say. A couple more questions. We're going to go to about 4:15, and then we're going to have wine, cheese, charcuterie, hummus, whatever.
I had a question about
Dave.
kind of balancing book projects and articles, and you know how not to destroy your book by publishing articles from it, but also you know maybe using sources, you know how you use sources that don't find their way enough into a book, but can be an article on their own. Like how do you plan this out? You know, because I think of in Professor Farr's book on authority and sexuality, you have that book, and then also the article you cite in it on authority and power in France. And then, for instance, with Professor Holt, your book on Burgundy that just came out, but then also your article on the Vignerons de Dijon. That I guess it was a little bit earlier, but I see that those two must be very connected. So how do you balance these? The relationship between those two.
Yeah, and you don't want to rob your monograph, like pulling an entire chapter out and publishing it as an article. My experience has always been to when you're writing a book, there's a lot of cutting that has to go on. You do endless amount of research, and you got all these notes, and then it's winnowing it down to something manageable. And your editor, like yours, may tell you to even cut it more. And so you have to throw stuff out, but a lot of that stuff is something you want to work with or you want to elaborate on that you don't have the space in a book, and that's an ideal opportunity to work it into an article. And you also, of course, are announcing to the scholarly community that you're working on this and that your book's forthcoming. So I think it has a practical, a practical purpose, but also it gives you the opportunity. Like I published an article on the whole death scene of Philippe Giroux when he was executed, and it's a very ritualized, a good death, and he's walking through the but if I had spent 30 pages on it in the book, it would have got kind of bogged down. Come on, let's get to the beheading here. But it was very rich, and I wanted to situate it in sort of the context of early modern capital punishment and that sort of thing. And so that was an ideal opportunity to publish that, and I published it in the Journal of Modern History, which is one of the flagship journals of our field. So I was hoping it would get a broad readership. But that it did, and I don't think it robbed the book. It just elaborated, and then I cited in the book. Say if you're really interested in blown up version of this, see my article. I don't think there's any. I think that's actually good. There's no harm in that. I don't think.
And in my case, writing several articles from the archival research I was doing actually changed the trajectory of the book. That is, until I went into more detail on certain things, I wasn't fully aware of what the larger project was going to turn out to be. So, I mean, it's different in every case. I mean, I certainly, if you've got one big conclusion and one big body of evidence to support it, you know, books and articles are different, and they fulfill different things. So yes, I mean, that sort of one of the first articles I published was on elections in Dijon in 1990, and then on the Reformation and Protestantism and the vignerons' opposition to it in 1993. But, you know, the book changed over the next decade or so into something different, that if I hadn't written those things, I might not have come across, or might not have thought of that, well, this is really important, and more important than this socio-economic / cultural total history, this much more ambitious and less focused idea that I started with. Usually articles are a lot easier to write than books, and quicker. And I think your comment, Jim, that, you know, your first article on a new project sort of announces to those who are interested, well, there's something more coming, and that's very useful too.
I would say two things about it as somebody who edits two series, one with Mack and one with Cambridge. Never give away the main argument of your book in an article, because then editors like Richard Fisher, who believes that most dissertations are 2 articles, and why should Cambridge be bothered to publish them? He's now retired. I don't know. You don't want to give them an excuse to just say, no, this has already appeared. You can do this in a different language. It's okay to have an article come out in French that lays out key elements of your French history book, but I would be very reticent to bring it out in the Journal of Modern History or whatever, because if you don't already have a contract, it could make it very difficult to get a contract. The other thing I would say is, let's say you've finished your dissertation and you're going to create it into a book. That's going to take some time, that process. And while you're doing that, we have a kind of a catch-22 system in most universities, where there's a lot of pressure for the assistant professor to produce that book to get tenure. And then if you just focus on that, you'll get zapped in merit evaluation every year, because you're not producing any articles and you're not producing a book. So what's the matter with your scholarship? So it's not a bad idea to have a couple of articles floating along. And nowadays, certainly here for tenure, you're going to have more than a book. You're going to have some articles. You're going to have significant progress toward a second book, according to the guidelines the provost had laid down. Different universities have different things. So the article book thing is not quite as simple as it appears. And in many places, assistant professors are punished in the merit evaluation pool because they're working on their book and they're not publishing anything. So you might want to think there is a cost to it even after you finish your dissertation.
There's also the other form of publication, which all of you will have the opportunity, I'm sure, when you become young scholars after you get your PhD, is book chapters. That people are going to come to you and ask, hey, would you? And there are book chapters, and then there are book chapters, because sometimes they're not as heavily vetted. And so when it comes time to evaluate the merit of these, as opposed to an article published in a leading journal, you have to consider this. Don't give yourself away because it's a publication, right? I got this book chapter, you know, because that, you know, too many of those can look not as rigorous as
absolutely.
And so if you're thinking about, and the other thing I think, if you're thinking about article publications, I would shoot high. I would kind of isolate the ones that are best in your field, and all they can say is no. And you can always drop down to a regional journal or something like that. But
and another strategy, if they say no, keep sending it back until they say yes.
Well, all of us have had the experience of having articles turned down. The article of mine that has been cited the most by Farr was turned down by 2 journals. The first one didn't think it was feminist enough, and the second one thought I was some sort of feminazi. Said all kinds of nasty things.
Women in economy?
The women in an economy, yeah. And the guy was a guy, and he wrote all kinds of, she's terrible, and she's this, that, and that, which I took as a great compliment. But it's, and then eventually got published, and then it was reprinted in a volume, and it's been cited a gazillion times, but it got turned down. And I virtually didn't change it at all, the 3 different things. That's happened to all of us, where you get stuff turned down, and same with book manuscripts. You know, some of you have seen the famous letter I got from Stanford where they told me to that your best option is probably to take up drinking. Because nobody's going to publish a book on taxation in 17th century France. Oh yeah, I should show you this letter. I got this wonderful letter where the guy says, well, no one's interested in this topic, and your real options are to change field, to quit the profession, or take up drink. And if it was me, I'd take up drink.
I would also.
I'm not making it. Am I making this up? You've seen the letter.
I mean, to go back to your original question, Nate, I'd also say, the field and the way you describe what you need for tenure, in history is very book biased. I know Natalie Davis was excoriated for years because she had never produced a book. But if you've written 3 or 4 path-breaking articles that change the way everybody in the field thinks about your field, that to me is much more important than, I don't know, some book on taxation.
Exactly. Well, I mean, the sad part is that there are a few people like Robert Desimos, a person like this, or Jean Mauvais, who way back, the analysts, all of the great analysts thought he was a greater historian than them, and he'd never published a book. And Le Roi d'André and Goubert and all
Charles
these
Taylor on the French Revolution.
Right? But that won't get you tenure in modern America. I mean, rightly, wrongly. I'm sorry, that's just how it works. But there are scholars like this who changed fields. And Mauvais' footnotes to his book on the Problème de subsistance under Louis XIV are still a mine of information. And you can see why all those people had such respect for him. But, in the modern world, if you don't publish a book, you're not going to get tenure in most places. Bill Beik's actually an interesting example. At Northern Illinois kept him on staff for years. And his book didn't come out, didn't come out, didn't come out. He got tenure before the book came out, because the book didn't come out until '85, and he had tenure long before that. And he published maybe 1 article, I think. But they'd seen the manuscript, they thought it was going to come out, and much to their credit, they kept him in the profession, and then he turned out a whole series of not only that terrific book, but other path-breaking scholarship. The sad reality of modern academia in America is that Bill would have been fired at Northern Illinois if that happened in the 2000s. And all the great stuff he produced we would never see. And so that's a real downside to our profession now, but it's the reality, I would say, unfortunately.
It's even more pernicious than that at some levels. Thanks to I've been serving as an expert witness in a number of court cases involving professors who've been denied tenure. The problem is not just within your own department, but when decisions are actually made at a university level where different departments have different standards. And if they don't understand that you're a book-based and they are article-based, there are people who serve on these committees who will reject your candidacy. And I've seen, some very distinguished institutions where this goes on. It's really disgraceful.